Go ahead.
I'd like to thank for the opportunity. My name's Marty Rowland from the New Orleans chapter, Schiller Institute, the group that helped defeat the goofball Woody Jenkins for Senate. But one of the thing I wanted to bring up is about the Lynn's article about Michael Novak, and there's a way of reading the material to where I know it as a person reading this, but there's, I think, a higher cardinality that I need to read this in order to organize around it, and particularly about the quote on about what Christians believe, and specifically, it seems like it's a tautology in the sense that we define God in terms of Christian principles, but then there's a sentence here that says, "For reasons I shall supply, Christianity knows, as a matter of reason, not a mere opinion, that God is a Christian." And so here I am in New Orleans with Nation of Islam, with Jewish groups, and this wide variety of people who call themselves Christians, is that the pedagogy that I would use being confronted, given this somebody to read, and they say, "What do you mean that God's a Christian?" So I guess what I want Lynn to describe is that method that I would use, or what is it that it's not a tautology?
Okay, gotcha. Well, first of all, God is also an ecumenicist. You see, the nature of Christianity, the nature of Christ, is to free man from a lot of things that were very bad. First of all, the Israelites had a bad belief. It was racist. The belief that any group of people has a covenant with God separate from the rest of the human race is wrong. It's immoral. It has nothing to do with God. And one suspects that that particular aspect of the writings may have been inserted in the 7th century BC in Babylon, when leading writers of Israel were taken to Babylon as captives and were told to rewrite the Mosaic texts. And you'll find, for example, an example of this is in the book of Genesis, one of the most flagrant ones. You have two completely different creation stories in the book of Genesis. One is in chapter 1, 26 to 28, on man. Man and woman were created in the image of God, were made in the image of God, and with a quality to exert dominion over the universe. Then you come along and you find another version of creation. God created Adam out of mud, not out of godly material, and he gave Adam a ribbing, which is the first marriage. And then Adam raised Cain until he was no longer able. Now, since it is a known point, I came across this question in a clear way, this specific question on Genesis, back in the 1950s, after I had completed these discoveries in economic science and related matters. I picked myself and said, okay, how do I extend what I know about economy in terms of principles of human behavior into pre-modern times? So I said, well, okay, we have, in the Middle East, we have all these cuneiform clay tablets which have been unearthed. And I knew something of what these clay tablets represented, both from the Sumerian version and so forth, and knew how they had to be read. So I set myself a project. I would get this information from clay tablets, and I would be able to construct a model of how these economies had worked based on these statistics which are in these clay tablets, which had been preserved because they were clay, whereas there had been on skins. There had been parchment records, but the parchment doesn't last like clay does, and therefore all the parchment records which are kept by the other people of the region, especially the Semitic population, were destroyed. And the only reason we had later, because on the Assyrian Empire, they revived the clay tablet the cuneiform tablet, for religious reasons or for religious cult reasons. And therefore, long after parchment had been well established from the Phoenicians on throughout the region, or actually the Canaanites, which was their real name at the time, that the Assyrians went back to the clay tablets, and therefore we had a whole new version of clay tablets of later vintage from the Syrian area, which also were copies, in a sense, putative copies of the histories and so forth of Sumerians and other words, which a lot of our knowledge about the early Babylonian, Akkadian cultures are based on these secondary copies of these clay tablets. And we ran into, of course, then the accounting tablets, which we got from some areas, or later dug out in the 1940s, 1950s, from the areas involving the ancient Hittite Empire, or the Hittite Kingdom. And we had a lot of records from that area of these, which were actually bills of exchange, with a two-part clay bill of exchange. You had, inside you'd have the contract, on the outside you would have the envelope, which is baked around it. And if you broke the envelope, you were committed to the contract. So these guys, you had this simple clay tablet bill of exchange was put in, which gave a lot of insight. So I began getting deeply involved in this material, and found out that a lot of the stuff that was in the Old Testament had nothing to do with the Hebrews, but was something that was stuck in there from these heathens, these terrible heathens, these Babylonians. Then I found out that this had all happened in the 7th century, when the Israeli captives had been forced to rewrite the religion. And what we have as a large part of the Old Testament are materials which are actually written into various books, and there are two primary versions of the Old Testament. You know, the one's the Egyptian Talmud, the other is the Babylonian Talmud, and they conflict in lots of ways. They're different stories. And you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is actually a Gnostic cult, which was not either anything at that time. It wasn't Christian, it wasn't Israeli, it wasn't Hebrew. But it collected all these writings and put them in copper plates and so forth. And they won't release them because it would expose a certain number of frauds on this Babylonian Talmud business. So therefore it was obvious to me that you had certain parts of the Old Testament which are completely inconsistent with each other, absolutely contradictory, like these two creation stories, the creation of man. But there were some things you could verify, and there were some things you knew were wrong, which should never have been published. They should have been cleaned out. They should have been recognized long ago, because they're not consistent with theology as we understand it. So that convinced me more than anything else that in dealing with these biblical stories, you have to know what you're doing. You have to know of your own knowledge that it's true. And you don't know, you weren't there, you didn't see it happen. You know that many of the accounts are false. Therefore, you cannot believe it on the authority of its being the Bible. But you have to know of your own knowledge that it's true. Now, in the case of the New Testament, there's not much of a problem there, unless you're an illiterate. Because we know the entire culture of the period of the New Testament was Greek culture. And therefore, if you understand the Greek mind and the mind of the Hellenistic period, then you know what the state of mind is from which communications are being made in that period. We also have a very good record on the New Testament in terms historically. It came in a historic period. The personality of Christ and the Christians and that in the first half century are very well documented. So this is not something you have to simply believe, while some guy existed, but the Roman records don't show any existed or anything like that, Jesus Christ and the Christians existed. No, this is well known. For example, the Apostle John lived into the 90s, and he was the leader of Christianity until the time he died. That's a century. Paul was executed, Peter were executed, but the circumstances, the places, their associations are well known. So these documents are understandable. The New Testament you can rely upon. The Old Testament you cannot rely upon. There are too many of this, for example, lots of the book of Daniel, for example, comes from Babylonian origins, does not come from any what would be putatively legitimate origins. Some of it's false, known to be false historically. But you can rely upon Christianity. You can rely on certain parts of the Old Testament. For example, Genesis 1 is absolutely consistent, not in terms of the dates, because they tampered with the creation dates, in a sense, in these things. You had this famous case of Archbishop Usher, who tried to prove that God was standing in Mesopotamia when he created the universe. Well, that's literally what the implication of the original story is, on which some of these things are based. So the question is, what do you know? Not what do you choose to believe, or what spoken authority, or what written authority, or what teaching instructed you to believe something. What do you know? Believe nothing you don't know. And as Plato said in dealing with Socrates, know yourself. That is, know how you know. And that's the meaning of what I said. The core meaning is I know God as a Christian, because I know the beliefs which we associate with the New Testament correspond to what I know. Not on the basis of some standing up at church and confessing their sins and saying, I want to give testimony. But I know, as a matter of scientific fact, that this is true. Other people may not. But I also know the nature of creation. And I also know that Christianity is concerned to save all people, that all people are considered our responsibility. And Christianity extends its grace to all people. And therefore, in dealing with people who have a different religious persuasion, especially monotheists, what you must do is don't try to resolve the differences in doctrine. Concentrate on those principles in which there should be agreement. And these are principles concerning, for example, Genesis 1, 26, 28. Man and woman are made in the image of God to exert dominion in the universe. And that man must be so treated. All men, all women must be so treated. And that's Christian doctrine. That did not exist until Christianity. The Hebrews were racist. The whole doctrine was racist. Maybe Moses wasn't. But what is transmitted as the Hebrew doctrine and the practice of Israel in ancient times was racist, in a time when racism prevailed throughout the earth. The first time the conception of a universality of man, of every individual, under the protection of God was Christianity. That's the origin of it. And every human being has that quality of made in the image of God. They're all born that way. And therefore, God is a Christian, because we believe that all men and women are each born with that divine quality which makes us all of one race, set apart from all other species to exert dominion in this universe. And that's what it means to be a Christian. That's the essential meaning. What do you think about man? What's your image of God? Well, that's a deeper question, which I also wrote about to some degree in that as in other locations, on this question of simultaneity of eternity, which is another very important principle in this, which is not original to me. This was actually standard Platonic theology among Christian fathers such as Augustine in ancient times. But that's another aspect of it. But essentially, in the essential question, are all men and women made in the image of God? Is racism contrary to God? Racism among human beings. Is that contrary to God? If you're a racist, can you be a Christian? No. You rejected God. You cannot be a racist. If someone is of a different religion, religious belief, can you reject them? You cannot reject them. Do you agree with everything they say? No. Do you agree with everything they say about religion? No. But as you, in your action toward that person, must be the action of a Christian. And you must treat them as in the image of God. no matter what your disagreements are. Huh? Leading writers of Israel were taken to Babylon as captives and were told to rewrite the Mosaic texts. And you'll find, for example, an example of this is in the book of Genesis, one of the most flagrant ones. You have two completely different creation stories in the book of Genesis. One is in chapter 1:26 to 28, on man. Man and woman were created in the image of God, were made in the image of God, and with a quality to exert. Go ahead.
I'd like to thank you for the opportunity. My name's Marty Rowland from the New Orleans chapter, Schiller Institute, the group that helped defeat the goofball Woody Jenkins for Senate. But one of the thing I wanted to bring up is about Lynn's article about Michael Novak, and you know, there's a way of reading the material to where I know it as a person reading this, but there's, I think, a higher cardinality that I need to read this in order to organize around it, and particularly about the quote on about what Christians believe, and specifically, it seems like it's a tautology in the sense that we define God in terms of Christian principles, but then there's a sentence here that says, "For reasons I shall supply, Christianity knows, as a matter of reason, not a mere opinion, that God is a Christian." And so here I am in New Orleans with Nation of Islam, with Jewish groups, and this wide variety of...
Christ is to free man from a lot of things that were very bad. First of all, the Israelites had a bad belief. It was racist. The belief that any group of people has a covenant with God separate from the rest of the human race is wrong. It's immoral. It has nothing to do with God. And one suspects that that particular aspect of the writings may have been inserted in the 7th century BC in Babylon, when
people who call themselves Christians, is that the pedagogy that I would use being confronted, you know, given this somebody to read, and they say, "What do you mean that God's a Christian?" So I guess what I want Lynn to describe is that method that I would use, or what is it that it's not a tautology.
Okay, gotcha. Well, first of all, God is also an ecumenicist. You see, the nature of Christianity, the nature of